Today we will discuss interdisciplinary research, and I will focus on the topic of my ERC project, which is hosted at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena. And that project is titled Millet and Beans, Language and Genes, the Spread of the Trans-Eurasian Languages. So we are the Eurasia Triangle Project, and we investigate how genetics, linguistics, and archaeology come together on the topic of Japanese prehistory and the topic of prehistory of East Asia in general. So, as for our schedule, in the past classes, we started with an introduction to the debate on the origins of Japanese, looked into the languages under discussion, said a few words about the methodology of historical comparative linguistics, and then went into the evidence, words, morphemes, and structural similarities. And then with our two guest speakers, we had a look at the peopling of Japan from an archaeological and a genetic perspective. And last time, then, we looked what linguistics could do for us, namely how linguists could make inferences about Japanese prehistory. And today I would like to wrap up with this last talk on the integration of language, culture, and genes in a holistic approach on the history and prehistory of the Japanese speaking people. We can proceed with the theory, the content of our class. And the first question is something that we touched upon last week, namely, what can linguists do for the science of human history? What can linguists tell us about the human past, and how do they do that? We saw these 6 different steps. Maybe you remember something about one of the methods or one of the aspects. So indeed, linguists can try to find out something about the dating. So when did certain linguistic groups split off, separate, expand? So we can try to find out about this dating. Other things? Very well. So that's the diversity hotspot principle you're recalling. So indeed, linguists also try to locate the homeland of a language family, and they have different techniques for that. Among them is the diversity hotspot principle, to which Daniela was just referring. Charlene, do you see something you recognize? Is Charlene there?
Hello, I just had to rejoin. Can you repeat the question, please? Because I'm having connectivity issues.
Okay. The thing was that linguists can help in various ways to explore the human past and even the human prehistory. And last time we found 6 different ways in which linguists can add to the reconstruction of the human prehistory. And can you recognize one of the symbols here, and about what linguists can do for us?
When looking at particular words, we can see what kind of peoples have had contact with each other. For example, if they have a certain vocabulary of farming, that people must have had contact with another group who also farm. So we can kind of make connections in languages to see which people had contact and might have had borrowings or language exchanges.
Yes, exactly. So if we find ancient borrowings between two languages, we can draw inferences about the contacts between the ancient populations. And then somebody else, maybe Julia Leidig, do you recognize another aspect?
Yes, I'm not quite sure about the symbols, but just in general, that linguists can reconstruct languages that were never written down just by comparing them.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly.
That was this symbol actually. So this is a language that is attested, and here are contemporary languages, and that can be reconstructed to a variety that has never been written down. Yeah, indeed, you're right. And then we still have this left. What is this? Uh, it's called cultural reconstruction, or through the proto vocabulary, we can determine the proto culture. So it's just based on the idea that if people had words for, say, cheese, that they knew cheese and that they were eating cheese. Yes. Very well. Then we have only one symbol left, and that is also partly, we already discussed it. That is that linguists can draw trees about how languages split from a common ancestor and diverged and spread over space. So then we have found all the things linguists can do for the science of human history. But of course, linguists cannot find out everything for themselves. They cannot do without the help of other disciplines, such as archaeology and genetics. And a key word here is triangulation. And with the triangulation, I mean the integration of these three disciplines, genetics, archaeology, and linguistics, to find out about human prehistory. So, to integrate these three disciplines in a holistic approach on the human past. That is basically also the key objective of my research team, the Eurasia Triangle team. So, in our team, here you see some pictures of our team. In our team, we have archaeologists. You already met, at least virtually, Mark Hudson, who is an archaeologist specialized in Japan and Korea and East Asia in general. And Tao Li was also an archaeologist who went now back to Wuhan in China, where he became a professor. And then we have two archaeologists who are specialized in the Liao dynasty, so which were Mongolic speakers of Khitan language. They are both PhD students. And then we also have geneticists like Chong Won-jong, who is now left and went back to become a professor at Seoul University in Korea, and Chan Chao Wang that went to also back to China, Shanmen University. And you met last time, you met virtually Ning Chao, who is a geneticist from Jilin University, who will now soon take a position in Beijing. So these are the Eurasia Triangle geneticists, and all other people you see on the picture are linguists. Here, for instance, Bing-chong Deng is a new doctoral researcher who is also joining this class, actually, Bing-chong. And Bing-chong is a specialist in Sino-Tibetan languages. And she is investigating very ancient contacts between the ancestors of the Sino-Tibetan languages, Proto-Sino-Tibetan and Proto-Semitic, and the Trans-Eurasian languages. And here we have Joanna Dolinska, who is also joining our class regularly. She's not there now, I see. But Joanna is a specialist in Mongolic and Tungusic languages, and she's looking into the ancient connections between these two languages, because that's a kind of a core in the tree. And then we have Rasmus, who is a doctoral researcher, and he is working on contacts between Proto-Indo-European and Trans-Eurasian. But back to our story of last time, back to the linguistics. Last time we ended with this slide that represented the spread of the Japonic language. And we basically traced the Japonic language back all the way to the West Liao River region around 7000 BC. And then we saw a split between Japano-Koreanic and Altaic, with Japano-Koreanic settling here on the coasts west of Liaodong. And then we see much later Japanic taking off around 1300 BC to the Korean peninsula. First, the Japanic people settle here, and only later, around 900 BC, they go to Kyushu, from where they spread to the Japanese islands around 180 BC. This is also represented in this tree. So that is basically what last time we said about the linguistic prehistory of Japanese in a nutshell. But perhaps we can engage in a little poll now. First, last time we spoke about Proto-Trans-Eurasian, and we found a homeland for Proto-Trans-Eurasian, a location where these ancestral speakers were living. Do you remember whether it was the West Liao River region, or whether it was the Liaodong Peninsula, or whether it was the area of Kyushu? So most people had that correct. So yes, it was for Proto-Trans-Eurasian, it was the West Liao River region. And then what about the timing? Was that 8,200 BC, or was it 7,200 BC, or was it C 5,200 BC? And here, the majority of people has the correct answer, 7,200 BC. That was the timing of the first split in Proto-Trans-Eurasian. So that is when Proto-Trans-Eurasian split into Japano-Koreanic on the one hand and Altaic on the other. And then, which culture did the people have? Were these speakers of Proto-Trans-Eurasian, were they hunter-gatherers? Were they farmers of millet, or were they rice farmers? And here, most people had it right. They were millet farmers. Remember the title of the project, Millet and Beans, Languages and Genes. Rice came in only later. So rice is a Bronze Age product, a Bronze Age crop that came in from more southern China, the Yangtze River area, and only entered, say, ore areas, the Westlia River area, after 3000 BC. And then some questions about Proto-Japano-Koreanic, the common ancestor of Japanese and Korean. Where did this common ancestor live? Was it in Kyushu? Was it on the coast west of Liaodong? Or was it on the Korean peninsula? And here, most people answer B, and that's indeed the correct answer. It was on the coast west of Liaodong. So Proto-Japano-Koreanic was not on the Korean peninsula yet. The Korean speakers went off later and went to the Korean peninsula by themselves. And then the timing, when did this Japano-Koreanic family split into Japanic on the one hand and Koreanic on the other? Or when did the speakers of Koreanic leave to the Korean peninsula? Was that 5500 BC, 3500 BC, or 1500 BC? And here are the poll results. And indeed, B is the right answer. 3500 BC is when Proto-Koreanic leaves to the Korean peninsula, and it also happens to be the date when millet agriculture goes to the Korean peninsula. And that brings us to the third question. Were the speakers of Proto-Japano-Koreanic were these people hunter-gatherers and fishers? Were they millet farmers and fishers, or were there millet rice farmers and fishers? And here, most people have it right. Everybody has it right. They were millet farmers and also fishers, because we see in the vocabulary that maritime vocabulary is added to Proto-Japano-Koreanic. We find that in Proto-Japano-Koreanic, but not in Proto-Trans-Eurasian. And then we move to Proto-Japonic. What about the location of Proto-Japonic? Was that in Kyushu? Was it on the Ryukyu Islands? Or was it on mainland Japan? So I will publish that. That most people had it right. It was indeed on Kyushu. Later, there was a split into two groups. One went to the Ryukyuan island, and another group went to mainland Japan. But first, the Proto-Japonic speakers arrived on Kyushu. And then the next question would be about the dating. When did Proto-Japonic split into its two main branches? When did it split in Ryukyuan on the one hand and mainland Japanese on the other hand? Okay. And here, most people have it right, namely 900 BC was this was is the time depth of Proto-Japonic. And then we can move forward to the last question on the culture. Were Proto-Japonic people hunter-gatherer fishers? Were they millet farmer fishers, or were they millet rice farmers and fishers? And here we have the majority saying C. Indeed, Japonic people had a whole package of agriculture, including rice, millet, but also barley and wheat. So this is our scheme for the background and the origin of Japanese. But then when we go to Proto-Japonic and its spread across Japan, we already saw this tree in the beginning of our class. I think that was given in the second class, where we see that around 180 BC, Proto-Japonic splits into mainland Japonic and Kyushu Japonic. So that means that here you have the people arriving from the Korean Peninsula, settling there with agriculture, living there between 900 BC and 200 BC, and then, or 180 BC, and then they start to split. First, the mainland Japanese people split and go to Honshu, Japan, and Shikoku and the other islands, and the Ryukyuan speakers stay on Kyushu until 900 AD, which is relatively late, and then they set off to Kyushu and they colonize the different Ryukyuan islands. This is, by the way, also the date that agriculture went to Kyushu. So the split of the language coincides with the time that agriculture was brought to the Ryukyus. Indeed, all Japonic languages share agricultural vocabulary. So most of the Japanese words that relate to rice or to millet agriculture can be reconstructed back to Proto-Japonic. That is so because they have not only mainland Japanese cognates, but we also find cognates across the Ryukyuan languages, like here in Shodan and Shuri, which are northern Ryukyuan languages, and Yonaguni, which is a southern Ryukyuan language. So, for instance, for rice, kome, you find in Shodan kumi and in Shuri kumi, or also for ine, rice plant, you find Ryukyuan cognates. And this is also the case for momi, husked rice, appa, foxtail millet, kimi or kibi in modern Japanese, broomcorn millet, hatake in modern Japanese, patake in Old Japanese, and ta, rice paddy. So all these words reconstruct back to Proto-Japonic and show us that the speakers of Proto-Japonic were well acquainted with agriculture. So this certifies the link we make between the speakers of Proto-Japonic and the so-called people of the Yayoi culture, the first farmers who arrived in Japan from the Korean Peninsula. During our class, we also spoke about Ainu, and we said that although the Ryukyuan languages look very much like Japanese, and they are actually cognate with Japanese and reconstruct back to Proto-Japonic, for Ainu the case is very different. We can say that Ainu is radically different from Japanese. And the reason, for instance, why it is so different lies in it being of the head marking type. As we saw, Ainu, when it expresses possession, it will mark possession on the head, on the eye here, and not on the dependent, like is the case in Japanese and in most other Trans-Eurasian languages. And linguists in the past have seen that if there is a sharp contrast with respect to head-dependent morphological marking type between a particular language and language within a proposed family, this can be taken as negative evidence for the assumed genetic relationship. So, if one language is head marking and another language is dependent marking, these languages are probably not genetically related. And this is the case for Ainu and Japanese. Nevertheless, there are some structural similarities between Ainu and Japanese. And Ainu And these structural similarities are probably a kind of Ainu due to an Ainu substratum inference in Proto-Japonic. We know that the Ainu language is like an isolated lineage that was isolated when the Japonic speakers came into Japan and pushed the speakers of Ainu to the peripheries of Japan, to the north of Japan. And we know that in Ainu there are a number of features that are typical for head marking languages. So they are typical for head marking languages like Ainu, but very atypical for dependent marking languages like Japanese and like other languages of the Trans-Eurasian type. These features are, for instance, the use of prefixes, prefixing morphology in spite of a verb final structure. So Ainu is verb final, but still it uses prefixes. A productive noun incorporation, that is what you do in words like babysitting or skydiving, where you incorporate the noun into the verb. So sky is incorporated together with the dive and you get a new verb, so to say, to skydive. Then you have also inclusive, exclusive distinctions on pronouns in Ainu. That is, that there is a different word for we including the hearer and a different word for we excluding the hearer. So there's this distinction between two we's, we one and we two. And then Ainu has also this distinction between intentional and non-intentional verb affixes. So when you do something intentionally, you will use another verb affix than when you did not do it on purpose. And then there's also an absence of core case marking in Ainu. For instance, nominative and accusative markers are not expressed in Ainu. And then when we look at Old Japanese, we see some of these features also occurring in Old Japanese, although they are very atypical for Trans-Eurasian languages and very atypical for dependent marking languages like Japanese in general. So, for instance, in Old Japanese, you find prefixes. Also, in current day Japanese, there are still a few prefixes in spite of the verb final structure, like mi for the honorific or o for the honorific, ma for the intensive, woko for the diminutive, sa for non agentive verb prefix, and i in active or an agentive verb prefix. You also find noun incorporation in Old Japanese, like for instance here in Amatobu Tori. This ama, the heaven, is incorporated in the flying, like in skydiving in English actually. So heaven flying birds. There's also in some Ryukyuan languages where you find these traces of an inclusive, exclusive distinction for the pronoun we. So in Irabu, you have, for instance, a do, we for the inclusive, and a ban, we for the exclusive. And then Old Japanese has some prefixes that make a distinction between intentional and unintentional. And then there's also frequent omission of nominative and accusative markers in Japanese, especially in its historical stages. So we think that all these features that are typical for Ainu probably were transmitted from Ainu in Japanese. And the way it occurred, that this occurred was most likely through substratum interference. That means that people of Ainuic living on the Japanese islands shifted to a new language, the language of the incoming Japonic speakers, the new target language. And by shifting to this new language and abandoning their own native language, they made some learning imperfections. So they had some problems mastering the new Trans-Eurasian language. And these learning imperfections were structural peculiarities from their own language, which they transmitted on the target language, on the incoming Japonic language. When, for instance, today speakers of Japanese speak English, You hear many instances of transfer of their own grammar or phonology into the English. One of the things, for instance, is the lack of distinction between R and L in Japanese. There's only one liquid phoneme, R and L, in Japanese. And when they speak English, you hear that immediately because they have problems distinguishing R and L. This is such a substratum interference from Japanese in English. I remember that when we were living in Japan, it was the time that Koizumi was elected as the prime minister, and they kept speaking about Koizumi's election in on television, but actually the word they said was not with the L but with the R. So we were constantly wondering what are they saying. So this is a typical case of substratum interference, and it is probably also what happened when they shifted to Ainu, or when the original Ainu speakers shifted to Proto-Japonic. So they took some language imperfections with them in Japanese, and this resulted in these structural features, these very atypical structural features being transmitted in Japanese. This is basically what happened, and this is how you can identify these different stages in language development with the different historical stages in Japanese. So the Ainu substratum, the original inhabitants of Japan, were the Jomon people, to whom Mark referred when in his presentation. It were the people living from 10 or 13,000 BC to 900 BC on the Japanese island. So they are actually the native inhabitants, the indigenous inhabitants of Japan. As we already said, the Ainu people looked a bit more hairy and a bit more robust faces, similar to the physiognomy and the morphology of the Ainu speakers who are now virtually extinct. So these Jomon people probably spoke pre-Ainu or different varieties, different daughter languages of Proto-Ainu. So Ainu-like languages that were most probably of head marking typology. But then in the Yayoi period, when the rice farmers came from Korea to Japan, the new Japonic language was brought into Japan. And this Japonic language was of Trans-Eurasian inheritance. It was related to other Trans-Eurasian languages and went back to a common ancestral language situated in the Westlia region. These Japonic speakers, these old Ainu speakers, shifted to the language of the incoming Japonic speakers and left some traces, some learning imperfections in Japonic, so that Japonic became structurally here and there an atypical Trans-Eurasian language. And later in the Kofun period, we see that were these big problems on the Korean peninsula, leading eventually to the Shilla unification, whereby Shilla unified the Korean peninsula not only linguistically but also politically. And this caused a lot of turbulence on Korea. And through this turbulence, many Korean speakers came to Japan during the Kofun period. And that resulted in many ancient Korean borrowings in Japonic during the time from 300 AD to 600 AD. So that's how Japanese developed over time. From a historical point of view, this was also the topic of Mark Hudson's talk last time. Unfortunately, due to the technical issues, he was only able to introduce the first part, what are origins and ethnicity. And as he was moving to the second part of his talk, early peoples in the Japanese islands, so the part that dealt with Jomon and Yayoi, Unfortunately, it went wrong with technical issues, and he was not able to finish his presentation. So he wanted to connect these early populations in the Japanese islands with the arrival of Japanese and the Japonic languages. And this is a slide that I took from Mark's presentation. I don't think he was able to show it. So you have in Japan this Jomon period from say 13,000 BC to 900 BC, where you have Jomon culture, uh, complex hunter-gatherers, some small-scale cultivation, such as some local soybean cultivation or azuki cultivation, but no big-scale cultivation, no rice, no millets, no other crops. And then in the Yayoi period, 900 BC to 300 AD, the farmers come in from the Korean peninsula with rice, millet, barley, wheat, bronzes, and so on. So they are the speakers of the Japonic language. In the general picture across East Asia, we see that here in the Liao River region, around 7,000 BC, millet agriculture is developed. The first millet farmers in Asia live here, so they are the first people to develop millet agriculture. They're also the people of the later Xiongnu, the later Xinglonghua culture, starting in 6,200 BC. And first, millet starts here and is domesticated in this area, but then around 3000 BC, millet is transmitted to the Russian Far East. Over the Amur, it goes more like this. Over the Amur, it goes to the Russian Far East to reach this Primoria around 3000 BC. And millet farming is also goes to the coasts of the coasts of between Shandong and Liaodong, and from there they go to the Korean peninsula in 3500 BC. So around 3500 BC, millet is spread across East Asia. Later, rice farming comes in. So rice farming comes in from the region of the Yangtze River. Around 4000 BC, it reaches the Yellow River region. About 3500 BC, it reaches the Shandong area. And around 3000 BC, it is transmitted between Shandong and Liaodong. And now only around 1500 BC, rice farming together with barley and wheat farming goes to the Korean peninsula. It arrives here on the Midwest coast, and then we see many farming villages here developing on the southern Korean coast. And from there, around 900 BC, rice millet farming, the whole complex, goes to Kyushu, from where it spread to Japan. So basically, we see a nice coincidence between the story about the spread of agriculture in East Asia and the story about the spread of language, Japanese in particular. But what about the genetics? Last time, or 2 times ago, 2 classes ago, we also had Chao Ning as a guest speaker. And Chao Ning is one of the geneticists in our team. And basically, in our team, we have focused on collecting ancient human skeletal remains. With the advances in ancient DNA techniques, we can now do some analysis that 10 years ago were not possible yet. So, in the last 10 years, the ancient DNA analysis has made major steps forward, and we are a bit benefiting from these advances. As we are working together with Chinese universities, and we're also having Chinese postdocs in genetics, We are lucky to have access to the Chinese samples because in China there's a very strict policy. It is illegal to bring out human skeletal remains out of the country. So that means that we cannot bring the bones to the Max Planck Institute, but we need collaborations in China. We have a collaboration with the University of Jilin here in North China, where they analyze the bones for us and we get the data to further investigate. For Japan and Korea, the legislation is a bit different. Together with our Korean geneticist, for instance, I went to Korea to sample bones. We got bones from a museum, and then I had to bring these parts of skeleton skulls in my hand luggage over the border to Korea. I needed a whole set of documents. Of course, what I was doing was legal, but it was a bit strange, of course, for the people at the border to find somebody with a skull in, in his handbag. But all was came well, and eventually the skulls were brought to the Max Planck Institute. And the same is true for the Jomon DNA we got from here. It's not indicated, but Mark Hudson, our archaeologist, was here doing excavations in Miyako Island near Taiwan. And thanks to Mark, we also got access to these ancient samples from Miyako Island and were able to analyze them. So this makes that we have a huge inventory of ancient DNA. So we have sampled ancient DNA from all the places from indicated here. So that includes the Yellow River, the Shandong area, then the West Liao area, Korea, Japan, the Russian Far East, here the Primoria, here the triangle signs are all in the Amur, and then here these diamond signs in the eastern steppes. So we have a good access to the ancient DNA. The red samples, the red points you see are all Neolithic samples. That means they are samples from before 2000 BC, and our green samples are Bronze Age samples or later. So that means samples from after 2000 BC. Here you see some pictures. Here is Ning Chao, but of course you don't recognize them. Sampling DNA in Banlashan in the West Liao area. Geneticists used to wear these white suits because they want to avoid contamination of the samples. Here too, they are working in the Yellow River region. Here you see Mark Hudson, who is working at his site in Nagabaka, Miyako. And here you see Chongwon with a skull that we then eventually took from Korea to the Max Planck Institute. The best thing is to sample skulls, if possible, because the petrous bone, which is a bone here near the ear, that contains a lot of collagen, and collagen has the best hope to preserve ancient DNA. So we also hope that we can find a bone from the skull here. Else, teeth can be very useful. And then teeth, and now they say also ankle bones, but that is still a bit difficult. So teeth and petrous bones are the best material to extract DNA from. So here then, this is also what Chao presented you last time. First, he presented you the genetic structure of modern Eurasian populations. So that is not the ancient samples, but the modern populations in East Asia. This is a principal component analysis, therefore it's called PCA, principal component analysis, and it shows the different individuals in terms of the two main genetic components. And we see that here there is an y-axis PC2 showing the difference between south and north. And here there is a PC1 that goes from west to east. So basically, here are populations of Europe, and here are the populations of East Asia, and the rest is in between. And as we see on the plot, the gray populations are the speakers of Turkic languages, that are the populations that are here. And contemporary speakers of, for instance, Turkmen, which is more in the west, plot more to the left, while speakers of Dolgan, which is in northern Siberia, uh, plot more to the east. So the Turkic languages are very spread, and they show an increasing degree of east-west admixture. Mongolic populations are a bit more conservative. They are more in the east, but they are also drawn a little bit towards the west. The most genetically conservative populations are the Tungusic speaking populations. They are here in the east, and they represent the oldest genome. And these Tungusic people are close to the speakers of Japanese and Korean, closer to Japanese and Korean than to the speakers of Sino-Tibetan that are here in blue on the plot. This is the structure of the present day populations, but then we tried to plot our ancient samples on top of the present populations to see where they plot on the plot. So here we see for all our samples from the Amur and the West Liao River region, especially the oldest samples, all plot on top of the present day speakers of Tungusic. That means that the present speakers of Tungusic are genetically continuous with these old samples. So they have the same kind of genes of these people of the Neolithic. They are the most conservative people. They probably represent the core Trans-Eurasian genes. So this West Liao Amur populations, these ancient populations, all plot together as if they have a common genetic component. And then if we look at our ancient genomes from the Yellow River, from the Yangshao culture and other Chinese cultures, we see that these plot all on top on the present day speakers of Sino-Tibetan. That means that the present day speakers of Chinese and other Sino-Tibetan languages are genetically continuous with the people who once lived in the Yellow River. So it clearly shows a distinction between an Amur genetic component in Trans-Eurasian speakers and a Yellow River genetic component in Sino-Tibetan speakers. So the two language families seem to go with a separate genetic component. In fact, our recent research confirms earlier models. There was Hanihara, a Japanese geneticist, who proposed the dual structural model of the population history of the Japanese islands. He did that in 1991, long before ancient DNA could be analyzed in the way we do it today. And he used classical markers such as blood groups and also morphology of skulls to come to his conclusions. But basically, his conclusions were right. So he found that the Jomon people served as the input of the Ainu people in the north and the Ryukyu people in the south, and that they also were the ancestors of the modern Japanese, but that they were not the direct ancestors of modern Japanese, but mixed with Yayoi migrants coming from the continent with Northeast Asian genes. So that is exactly what happened. This dual structure model by Hanihara was simplified by this dual structure model given in Mark's presentation, where he had the Jomon being the direct ancestors of the Ainu and the Ryukyuans, the Okinawans, and then also being the ancestors of the mainland Japanese. But here you get this admixture with incoming Yayoi people from the continent. This is indeed true. The only thing we found now is that this Jomon contribution to mainland Japanese genes is very low, that it's only 10%, and all the rest, 90%, comes from the continent, from Northeast Asia, more particularly from the West Liao River region. So this is the genetic picture in a nutshell. Before, say 10,000 years ago, we find a big gene pool of Amur ancestry in Northeast Asia. This gene pool reaches from the Baikal to the Primoria, to the West Liao, to Korea. So it's the genes, it's the genetic profile of the hunter-gatherers in that region, and it also becomes the genetic profile of the earliest farmers that here farming develops around 7000 BC. So you first have this Amur gene pool. In and around Japan, you have another gene pool at that time, the Jomon gene pool. And then after 5000 BC, this Amur gene pool get gradually and mixed with a Yellow River gene pool, and over time more and more Yellow River genes get mixed with Amur genes. And then when rice agriculture is taking from the Shandong-Liaodong interaction sphere to Korea, and from there to Japan, Yellow River ancestries are taking over Korea, to Kyushu, and finally to Japan, where they mix with underlying Jomon ancestries. So putting the three pictures together in by way of triangulation, for Japan, as Mark introduced to us, we have this society of Jomon people, hunter-gatherers who lived on Japan before 900 BC. And then you have the incoming Yayoi people who arrive in Japan after 900 BC. And what we have seen at the linguistic side is that these Jomon people can be connected with a pre-Ainu and Ainuic language. They were speaking probably different Ainuic languages until the Yayoi people came in, and the Yayoi people brought a Trans-Eurasian language, namely Japonic, to the Japanese islands. So these Jomon people abandoned their own language and they shifted to the language of the incoming Yayoi people. Only very few people did not shift, and those people were pushed towards the north in Japan, where their descendants lived until very recently, namely the speakers of Ainu. This Jomon Yayoi transition involved not only language, it also involved agriculture. As we said, Jomons were hunter-gatherers and they shifted to agriculture. The incoming Yayoi people brought millet, rice, barley, and wheat agriculture from the continent around 900 BC. And then we see that this whole movement had also a genetic aspect, namely the Jomon people had a very typical genome that is still highly reflected in the Ainu and the Ryukyuan people, but that is only for 10% present in the modern Japanese. That is because of the mixture between Jomon and Yayoi genomes when the Yayoi came on the Japanese islands. So the Yayoi mixed with Jomon, and that gave this mixture that also led to the modern Japanese speakers. And putting it into a wider framework of triangulation across East Asia, I would connect the earliest origins and the earliest spread of the Trans-Eurasian language with the beginning of millet agriculture in Northeast Asia, namely in the West Liao region, and also connected to the earliest days of the Amur gene pool. We see that millet spreads to the Russian Far East, and that millet spreads to Korea in the Neolithic. But it is not until the Bronze Age, here in green, that speakers of Sino-Tibetan having a yellow river genome add rice to the agricultural package, so that here on Shandong and Liaodong, rice agriculture develops. And from Shandong and Liaodong, the rice is transferred to the Korean peninsula around 1500 BC, and from there it goes to Japan 900 BC, where it causes this admixture between Amur Yellow River ancestries and Jomon ancestries, which we find today. So basically, I think that our whole Trans-Eurasian linguistic picture is mirrored very well in both the archaeology, at least in the spread of agriculture in the region, and in the spread of genes. That is the outcome of our Eurasian Triangle project, and that is also the message I hope you take away from this course. So I think we are there. We reached our conclusion for today. Are there any questions to this? If I don't see any questions appearing or no raised hands, so then if there are no further questions, I would like to leave it here, and then I'm looking forward to your presentations next weeks and the weeks after that. So good luck and see you next time. Bye.
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 Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.